Hello and welcome to the Not Real Men podcast. We're great at technology because we're men.
That's true.
I'm Laser and I'm a trans guy and I'm happy to be here. Who else is here?
I'm Colin. I am a person who is non-binary and has dwarfism and stuff.
Amazing. And we have brought in my most bullyable friend today. Writer, performer, used to be a stand-up comedian, now just a storyteller and just a great guy, Dan Prevette. Hi, Dan Prevette. How are you doing?
Hi, I'm doing well. I'm Dan Prevette. I am a cis hetero normie who is just a storyteller.
You're incredible, is what you are. And I'm so glad you're here. Dan, the reason I wanted to bring you on this podcast is because you and I have very interesting conversations about gender. You have known me since I started T.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I didn't know I caught you at the beginning of your journey.
Yeah. And I've been following you since a year ago.
Long after I started T.
Amazing. So I want to talk to you about a lot of things. We have questions from listeners. And the big one that I kind of am basing my questions off today is, how do you see the dynamic between masculine and feminine in the culture? This is by somebody who is a mom of trans twins, which sounds like a great person. And this is something that I find very fascinating as somebody who came from being in groups of all women where I was fitting in like a spy, and now being in groups of men, which is different. It's different. And I'm very curious how that feels to other folks too. I want to start with this question for both of you, which is, how in control do you feel about your relationship with masculinity in terms of like testosterone, like the things that your body considers masculine and that the way that controls you, if that makes sense as a question?
It does. I didn't know that you were expecting me to be a Neil deGrasse Tyson on this show.
Yeah.
I would really love to pitch this over to Colin.
Yeah.
So I can get a feel for the temperature of the room.
Yeah, Colin, kick us off.
Great. I'll be the barometer for masculinity in this room, which is what my nickname was in high school.
Yeah.
And yeah, I wore Pokemon t-shirts. I had long hair. I played violin and was on the jazz band. Peak masculinity.
Yeah. I've seen photos of you as a child playing violin, and I was like, that's a masculine child. That's what I looked at.
Yeah, truly.
Like,
all of those things are rad. All of that stuff.
I mean, at the time, they weren't like cool though. They were like in the transitional period from like 90s 2000s era rom-coms where nerds were bad to like the post 2010s where nerds were good. Mm-hmm. And so my school kind of lagged behind that a bit. What was the question?
Yeah, sure. I'm gonna make it more specific now that you started. Like, do you feel like having that relationship, like you just mentioned a bunch of things that I feel like you mentioned because they don't feel masculine, or they didn't feel masculine.
They weren't designated as masculine.
Yeah.
When I was there, and luckily I still did them. I wasn't as like vocally proud about it as I could have been.
Yeah.
Survival amongst peers is a hell of a drug.
Yeah.
But,
mm-hmm.
I think that's my question, is like, do you feel like you were trying to be masculine? Is that, or like, do you feel like not being masculine was a thing that affected
I think I
you?
picked my battles. Like I knew I wasn't going to like be on the sports teams. Like I knew that wasn't going to happen. So I wasn't, I mean, there were still things where like, the word gay was still being used as an insult then. And so I was like, I don't think I perpetuated that, but I definitely didn't want to like, I didn't want anything that would be like, here's more eyes on you. Here's more things. So I would like, if people would call me like either gay or like the F word or like that kind of thing, then I kind of wanted to distance myself from that. So I think I did let groupthink, influence that a lot. But I mean, in high school, that's all you have, right? It's like you only have like those peers for 8 hours every day. And then you go home to family and like hang out with friends sometimes. But I think letting go of that was definitely a paradox, because I still wanted to be seen as like a man, but I knew that was not really in the cards and I also like didn't want to pretend to like things that I didn't. So I didn't pretend to be into cars or like wrestling or I don't know. Those are the things. Yeah. Cars and
Those are the
wrestling.
two things. Wrestlers driving cars.
That's it. Yeah.
Yeah. That is being a man.
It's interesting because I had like I had a pretty like non-typical upbringing. I mean, Colin Laser knows me pretty well, but you and I, we'll just jump right into it. But
please.
Yeah, I was raised as an evangelical missionary kid. I was raised overseas. So I was raised like away from America, which was interesting because I'm maybe the most American, stereotypically American looking person that I've ever experienced. I'm blonde. I'm pasty. I'm very large. I look like a Seth MacFarlane character, like a cartoon character. I look like a featured member of American Dad.
You look like Taylor Swift's boyfriend is who you look like.
Okay. That is the finest compliment. Travis Kelce is a beautiful creature.
Yeah, how tall is he compared to you?
I would have to look it up, but I have to imagine that he is similar. I think when he sits on his wallet, quite a bit.
Yeah, you look like what all American dads want their American sons to look like, which I think is weirdly pressure.
Well, and I was weirdly confronted with that. I always knew that I was always a big boy who turned into a big teenage boy who turned into a big teenage man. And like at every one of those periods, I could always feel like I don't feel like my body because I am expected to be good at sports. I am not, nor have I ever been. I was always interested in, I think, Colin, what you referred to a little bit earlier is those things that were like maybe stereotypically a little bit quote unquote nerdy, or just, I always liked things that were a little bit left of center. I loved like hardcore music and emo music. I was a huge movie nerd. I would just like escape into movies and TV. So I was always interested in more like artistic things. And on top of that, I was a really big, sensitive, emotional boy on top of it all. So like, I'm this kind of like emo sensitive guy in this giant linebacker body. And I was always very aware of that dichotomy. Like, I felt like I never quite lived up to anybody's expectations. And
that's why you're an artist.
Yeah, I think, well, that's why I had to become an artist. There were no other options. And you turn to comedy when you realize that you can get laughs falling down and making fun of how big you are. So,
yep.
But it's interesting. I want to be sure to go back to actually like touching on the question that your fine listener posited to us. It was something in regards to masculinity and culture.
Yeah. I'm going to get back to that, but I want to hop into, while we're talking about high school, I want to talk about puberty. When you have the horrible monster inside you that I've, like named and talked to, of like, I am now 35 and going through male puberty. And I think it's very interesting, like the sex and gender of it, or whatever that is. But like, what did it feel like to have a monster in your body? Do you feel like you had like, I just like all of a sudden realized I can't stop looking at boobs if they're around. You know what I mean? And I'm so glad I'm not 12.
Well, when I was 12 and 13, we simply called that the flesh. And I knew that was sin taking form in my life. So,
oh, that's so healthy.
You and I have talked about this, Laser, because I think your point of view has really helped me understand just how much testosterone just sounds like an absolute poison. Like it just sounds like it poisons your mind and your body, especially if you start experiencing it in adulthood, because you get the full brunt of like, this is not normal.
Sure. I mean, but it weirdly is. Colin, do you have memories of this, or like, does it manifest? I'm just so curious what this feels like.
So thinking back to like when because I hit puberty super late, like at like 14-ish, 14 or 15, no, 15, because it was sophomore year of high school. Mm-hmm. And I remember because like I got cast in the musical freshman year, and then I didn't sophomore year because my voice was cracking so much.
Aww.
And they were doing Grease, and I was really upset, but it's fine.
What did you want to be in Grease?
I want to be the lead.
Yeah,
but, that's what
I would pay any amount of money to see you, especially at 14, with a cracking voice playing.
Yeah.
You have an incredible head of hair. I feel like you
Thank
got
you.
this.
It's being very like top lit right now by the light in the air.
It's angelic. It's angelic.
Very. I'm a pure boy who has never done anything sinful in his entire life. I lived in New York for 13 years, and this is the most pure person you'll ever meet.
It is so hard to live in New York for 13 years and not accidentally do cocaine.
Yeah.
I don't have a comment on that, but I'm going to move on. Anyway, puberty. Because I had my own, and I'll probably get into this later on some sort of thing. And I've talked about it on my social media a bit, but I struggled with body dysmorphia and body image issues for a very long time. So I think the internalization of a lot of that and that kind of thing kind of led to this sort of weird half experience of the hormonal big mouth puberty monster part of puberty, where it wasn't like I'm horny all the time. It was more like I feel drawn to people a lot and I want to talk to people a lot more, and I don't know how to do that. And I mean, don't get me wrong, there was still some, that thing that was there that's like, hey, that you're experiencing and that Dan, you probably experienced is still there, but it was more of a, I don't know if stifled is the right word, but redirected.
It's just demisexual puberty is fascinating to me.
That was the other thing is I didn't know I was demisexual yet. I just because I would be energy. It's not I mean, I'm presuming this is the puberty episodes where we can talk about whatever, but it wasn't
please.
When I would experience attraction, it was more of a feeling energized turn, when you're super introverted, but there's one person that you feel extroverted by. And that's kind of dialed up a lot. That's sort of how, because I remember my awakening to oh, I like this was when I was watching Lilo and Stitch and when Nani kicks the car and she's like, watch where you're going, stupid head. And then I was like, I like this. I don't know why. And then
my wife.
My wife.
Yeah.
That's such a perfect poll because Lilo and Stitch was so formative for so many.
Oh yeah. That's a good. And then
she's great.
Yeah. And then I remember liking the Pink Power Ranger when I was younger, but specifically the parts where she would be really good at gymnastics or when she would sidekick people in the chest. And I was like, I'm not gonna, I don't know why. This is to clarify for anyone who's listening, who's drawing conclusions from this. There are multiple memes that are describing what I'm saying.
Yeah,
it's important to disclaimer that I'm drawn to people that have the capacity to kick my ass, not the people that will. If that makes sense. It's an important distinction.
Dan, you like being scared by women, right?
Yeah, that's something we have in common.
Great, love it.
Yeah, I think there's something about that as a massive man too. The thought of being physically intimidated by someone has always been a little bit alluring to me.
For me, it's more of the someone who's more assertive is less likely to adhere to gender norms. And I didn't know that when I was younger, but I think that was there. And that sort of baseline understanding of oh, people with those qualities are less likely to adhere to these weird heteronormative personality traits that we've ascribed to the people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, the rule that we've talked about before of can you date a woman who's taller than you? Are you allowed to be attracted to that kind of person?
Yeah. And that was the thing of I love male logic. It's like male math, but worse. And, where they're oh, you I just can't I think it's a biological thing and I can't be attracted to a woman who's taller than me. And I'm in the gym locker room yeah, that's rough, buddy. Can't relate, but I don't really have that option, but I don't think science is backing up. And then Resident Evil 8 came out and it proved that everyone's a hypocrite and has a giant ass kink. So Lady Dimitrescu broke the internet, and then people were like, oh my God, a woman who's 2 feet taller than me. And I'm like, that's just my life. Everyone's I'm 4'3". Everyone's around 2 feet taller than me. Why? It made me mad. I'm not actually, but a little bit.
I get that. So I'm 6'7", and I have always been bothered by the notion that women will be height supremacists towards men, and men aren't supposed to date women that are taller than them. Colin, there's this weird Venn diagram that you and I probably exist in where our worlds are technically opposite, but there's probably a lot of shared identification in regards to our size has always been a key feature of our humanity to other people.
Yeah. So, and I imagine that that's like at the forefront of how people both ascribe our relationship to masculinity and how we've experienced it is through that filter of like, as someone who, for me, like no one assumes that I can do anything that's ascribed to masculinity. Whereas like with you, it's sort of like expected, and it's like what we actually like or that kind of thing probably had to be unpacked over time, as opposed to like how much we had to perform in order to fit in, or pretend we liked things we didn't, or pretend we didn't like things that we did.
Right. My capacity to disappoint knows no bounds. But I think I as like a giant guy who so rarely has experienced a woman being bigger than me, I too got pulled in by that meme and was like, I'm 100% into this. Yeah. Like there's something about this notion of like a woman towering over me, which I don't think I've ever physically experienced. I think there are maybe only a handful of women in America and probably in the world who tower over me. Mm-hmm. And so to me, it's like, it's so purely a fantasy that it is a fantasy. But yeah, I think that this is where the conversation gets a little bit weird. But I wonder if for a lot of the men who would deny having a little bit of that feeling, I almost wonder if there's something a little bit like matriarchal about it. I wonder if there's something like slightly maternal or like some kind of a Freudian element going on there for a lot of men.
Yeah. I think that, but also I think that a lot of guys are scared to like, because a lot of value is placed on strength and like physical strength and dominance, hunter gatherer, what like that weird stuff that we're brought up to be like, this determines your value. And if someone's taller than you, then like there's a chance that they'll be better at some of those things than you are. And I think that's also for me why I was like, good, someone that's better, that's clearly better than me at things. Like I'm not gonna do these things anyway. So like if someone's great at them, amazing.
I think I tend to assume that if men are overly hung up on not wanting a woman to be taller than them, like I think it's really ridiculous when perfectly like statistically average sized dude, you're 5'9", 5'10", 5'11" guys don't want a woman to be taller than them in heels. It gives the same energy as like men who are afraid of women out earning them. And it just feels like, why get hung up on this?
Yeah, it's like I've been programmed to have this be my metric for my value, and I'm going to, instead of do therapy about it, blame women for it. And it's like, all right.
Yeah. That's such a vibe. I will say, like, since starting T, I have found myself, like, instead of processing emotions, legit, my first impulse is to take it out on like a woman. Like it's like literally like I should yell at a girl about this, which is so flipping wild of like, oh, I'm frustrated. I didn't get any work done. It's probably my girlfriend's fault for not doing dishes. Like, what am I talking about? The little monster inside my head is so loud, and I might be crazy, but I like talking to other people about it to find out if that monster exists.
I don't think that's crazy, Laser. I think that you are experiencing at 35 what a lot of us probably experienced at 13. So we just had years of learning to not like yell at.
Yeah,
you're just still learning how to bury that shit. Just bury that shit deep down.
Yeah,
just
don't process it. Well, it is interesting because I'm like, I shouldn't bury things, but then like I literally have a monster in my head who sees a woman is like, my job is to impregnate that person. And that's really hard for me to do for a lot of reasons. And also a thing I shouldn't be trying to do, but also just like and it's absolutely wild to have that suddenly be the thing that my lizard brain is most interested in, is instead of being like safe or something, it's like, well, have you shot anybody full of cum recently? No. Well, are you really living?
So,
Yeah.
I mean, are you really living is a great question. But in the interest of showing solidarity with you, I am going to really tell on myself right now. I shouldn't be doing this in a public way, but I have had this conversation with several of my close lady friends recently where I am like, look, I will never do this. I will never act on this, but I am at an age 35 where I am like, damn it. I get the instinct of why men catcall. I'll never do it. I will never do it. But I understand you just see a beautiful woman and something in you is just like, oh my God. Oh, thank you. Just thanks for doing that. Thanks for being
your service.
And it is something primal and weird that I'm like, do not dare act on that and shout that out of a moving car. Keep that shit buttoned up. But it is embarrassing that it's in there. And I'm just like, well, I guess that's where we are now.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting hearing the impulse for that. Cause like I experienced not catcalling. Well, I got catcalled once. I was at Union Square and this woman was like, she shouted, "Do he got the booty?" And I was, when you hear a thing for the first time and you don't know what to do because your previous life experiences haven't prepared you for this moment. So I just instinctively looked down to check because I was like, I gotta find out, I guess. And then I just gave her a thumbs up, like you do, and then I continued walking. And but
that's such a good response of do I? Yes, thank you.
Yes, I mean it's a scientific method, Yeah. So when in doubt, just. In doubt, fuck around and find out.
That slogan is right for podcast merch.
Yeah.
Thank you. I hope no one uses it out of context to justify bad things. But
yeah. But I think probably you've been yelled at in public more than anyone.
Oh, yeah. For my, So because I get my appearance gets commented on, but it's not a sexualized or a look at how beautiful. Well, maybe a couple times, but I don't know. As Laser says, I can't stop modeling ever. So that's, And I think there's that from my understanding, because I used to have guy friends that would do that. And then I'd just sort of look at them questioningly. And for them, I had to read it on as I'm afraid of dying alone and I don't know how to have an actual conversation. Mm-hmm. And whenever I see someone who's aesthetically pleasing, I need to initiate some sort of interaction and I don't have an end goal. But
yeah, I think there is kind of a logical fallacy that a lot of men fall into of you miss every shot you don't take. So they just take all the shots.
It's the spaghetti method, but you throw all of the spaghetti and the spaghetti is harassment.
Right. That's right. I remember having a man tell me one time when I was probably 23 and I was, I still am, but at the time, particularly sheepish about talking to women in public and not wanting to approach women in bars and stuff. And a slightly older male coworker was like, dude, the best pitchers or the best batters in history only hit 30% of the balls. Those are the best in history. And I was like, this is kind of a weird analogy for I guess mathematically what you're saying makes sense. And his whole point was just swing at everything. Just swing at everything. But if you take that to its logical end, it has you screaming out of car windows at people, and that's just inappropriate. It's just not how life should be conducted.
Yeah.
I love this conversation because I think for so long I lived in and still am, but a feminist, but lived in these feminist communities that just had no male input and would, I think, completely reasonably, when men are talking about body image or talking about how hard it is to not yell at a woman from a car and stuff, there's just no sympathy for that, right? There's just no, you have no idea what it's like to have a body image issue because you don't have the woman socialization of this, or you have no idea what it's like to be sexually harassed all the time. But it is legit, with complete sympathy to all of that shit being extremely real. When I started T, and which is the only experience I could talk about, I suddenly had a lot of sympathy for actually there is like this image of what makes a man attractive, and there is this image of what you have to do to be, or like what your body wants you to do to be a man. And like I think part of it is just the testosterone. Like I've never felt more in touch with the evolutionary process that made me. Like I feel like my body is constantly trying to get me to procreate by yelling at women and looking at tits and all. It's wild.
I'm going to preface this, what I'm about to say with this is very heavy, and I don't really have a joke to like lighten it up. So I think, because I've been like thinking about like, because I haven't really thought about this in a very long time of like that, you know, like what urges I had when I was that age and like that kind of thing. And I think that because I hit puberty so late, I had already internalized so much ableist stuff of like, if I have a baby with someone who doesn't have dwarfism, there's a 50-50 chance that it'll have dwarfism. And that, you know, I, as someone who has achondroplasia, have less severe, whatever the hell that means, stuff where I haven't ever had to have surgeries on my neck or ear tubes or anything. And someone else might not be so lucky or like that kind of thing. And so I think that like by the time I hit puberty, that like urge, that like subliminal lizard brain thought of like procreate, spread your genetics, whatever, had kind of been pushed to the back burner because I had a lot of self-hatred at that time. And I don't think that was like a thing that I just even thought of wanting to do. And I, you know, I mean, don't get me wrong. Like there were times where I was not like my best self as a teenager, which is shocking because all of us were.
Yeah.
And I mean that to say I wasn't like some paragon of like masculinity. Like I still messed up. I've still made people feel uncomfortable, like that kind of thing when I was younger. It
feels like an internalized like eugenic situation. Is that?
Oh yeah. Yeah. Because like there's, you know, all of media, lack of representation, like, you know, lack of being sexualized other than in pornography, like all these like multi-layered things that at the crux of it are like you procreating is bad.
That's fucking awful. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a brutal thing to have to experience.
Yeah. Well, and if you like get harassed enough as a kid, you're going to be like, well, I don't want someone else to go through that. Like, I don't want to bring someone else into the world knowing they're going to go through that. And
it reminds me in a far more trivial way. I used to make a lot of jokes in regards to myself because I was really insecure about my size. I was tall and I was heavy set. So I just took up a lot of space, and I was always very uncomfortable with that. And I used to make a lot of jokes about like, well, I'm going to have to marry a short girl in order to even this out. So I wonder, obviously you're describing an extremely, extremely like concentrated and painful version of that. But I wonder that self-selecting out instinct. I wonder if there is something about like just more gentle personalities, or like, I wonder if certain personalities are more prone to like, well, I'll go ahead and opt out versus personalities that are like, I got to throw my spunk up everywhere.
I think that's anxiety.
That's what you're describing is trauma and
CPTSD. Yeah.
It never occurred to me to talk about women like I was trying to bat for 1,000. Like it never occurred to me.
Yeah, let's not swing at women. Let's all like agree that we shouldn't do that. If that's okay.
I mean, don't get me wrong. Like when I was in high school and college, people would guys would talk about how many people we slept with, and like that was like considered social currency. And I definitely like, you know, fed into that. Yeah. Even when it wasn't like what I actually believed or what I wanted, I still perpetuated that shit. And it's not. And I'm saying that to be like, hey, don't do that. Like it's.
I think I mean, honestly, that's just what I want to talk about in this podcast is like all this stuff about masculinity we don't talk about. And that brings me to the next question I want to talk about is, I guess it's an element of code switching, but also defense and all of this, like the difference between being in a group of all men, whether those are men who you are aligned with or not, versus being in a group that of all women or like of mixed gender? Like, do you find, whether at your current version or any other version of yourself, that those are different experiences for yourself, and what gender means for you in those situations?
So in regards to code switching, just like the question being around whether or not I feel myself behave differently when I'm surrounded by women versus when I'm surrounded by, let's just say, cis hetero dudes. Mm-hmm. I think I would certainly say in years previous and when I was younger, 100%. Now I have worked pretty hard to try to bridge the gap between who I am in those two spheres. But in general, I find that I'm more or less the same person in both of those groups. I will probably be more emotionally effusive or like emotionally vulnerable in a group that is more feminine versus like a group of men, especially if I don't know those men very well. But that being said, I've been in plenty groups of cis hetero men where if we all feel safe and there is a level of trust there, I'm just as emotionally like vulnerable and raw and open as I would be around a group of women I didn't know, far more so. In some respect, I can probably be even more guarded around a group of people that I don't know. So I think it has more to do with a certain amount of social comfort than the genetic or cultural makeup of the group itself.
That makes sense.
I think Dan, you mentioned something about like making jokes about like self-deprecating humor. And I think for being in groups of men, I felt like I had to do that a lot. Because like a lot of male bonding is through insults and jokes and like giving each other shit. And it felt like there was the elephant in the room that no one was talking about. So I had to like break the ice and be like, hi, I'm cool with this. I don't have like a chip on my shoulder or a hang up about this. And then that sort of like would give more like settling into that kind of thing. I mean, now I don't really, like Dan said, like the groups of guys that I am friends with still are people who I can be emotionally vulnerable around and that kind of thing. But there's still more of testing the waters I feel like I have to do with men, which also sidebar, men don't trauma dump on women. Nice women aren't your therapists. Yeah. I saw that tweet and like that was like during a heavy therapy time and I was like, I'm gonna go reevaluate everything about my life real quick.
This is interesting because it's not necessarily the answer I was expecting, which is good. Of like open to being more emotional around women. I mean, I'm trying to do more bro downs recently, and I'll admit I'm not going all the way in. I'm hanging out with Dan Prevette, who is, while a wonderful human, probably not the most toxically masculine. But it seems
an interesting goal to have, to want to willingly do that, to hang out with
Well, since transitioning, I have multiple times had guys high five me about how great my girlfriend's boob job is, which I didn't expect to happen, but also I'm fine. Like she's also fine with that. So it's whatever. But I think it's interesting because I think there is an emotional, and maybe it's just me becoming the person who I am, which is probably pretty likely, but there's a level of, maybe we don't call it emotional, but like truth that I would share with men that I don't necessarily with women, just like we're on the same page about, we're all fighting a little, a demon that wants us to do these things. So we can talk about like, I feel really lonely, but also I kind of just want to have sex. And like, I want to, these, there's an amount of like objectifying strangers that happens in a group of men, like not in necessarily a demeaning way, but of just like, can we all agree this is beautiful? Yes, we can. That I don't know necessarily I would do in a group of a mixed gender group if not everybody is on board with that. Does that make sense as a thing?
I think that whereas when I was younger, I would probably speak differently. I would use a different vernacular if I was surrounded by dudes versus if I was surrounded by girls. And now I'll pretty much say the same thing. Like if I am with a guy friend or I am with a woman friend, if I see a beautiful woman, I might just turn to them and be like, that was the most beautiful woman I think I've ever seen. And I would say that I would like make that comment to both. it's not like I would say to the guy, like, holy shit, did you just see that total hottie or whatever? I don't even remember.
I just saw you avoiding saying the word bitch, and it was really adorable. You were like,
I will not say it live on air.
I've never heard you say that word. Just for the record, for anybody thinking about hiring Dan.
So I feel like, again, I have kind of like bridged the gap. And if I'm going to use like more, I don't know, let's say humorous verbology, it'll be because I really, really know the person and I know that they know me.
Yeah.
Not so much whether that person is a man or a woman or regardless of any other personal identifier.
Yeah. This is fascinating as a demisexual.
I know. Also, and you're also agender, non-binary. Like, I do think that comes into this.
Most of my friends are queer artists, so it's like, even if like they're cis or not, like most of my friends are very, that person's hot. So like, no matter what,
great
of the technicolor rainbow of gender they occupy.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I have a couple guy friends who will be like, oh, that like Dan said, like they'll be like, oh, that person was really attractive. And I'll be like, huh? And then so like, or I was like distracted because I wanted to pet the dog that this other person had. And then that's, you know, like,
Colin, you couldn't be more you if you tried. And I love everything about you.
And I think something that like, this is about as personal as I'm willing to get.
Mm-hmm.
Something that I'm unpacking is like, whether being demisexual is a trauma response to like not being able to trust people, or if it's like intrinsically there, or if it's like a thing that I developed when I was young to like have some sort of filter between allowing myself to be vulnerable without having some modicum of like vibe check trust thing.
Interesting.
I love a trust.
This is a bit of a backward step just to the previous conversation, but something you said, Colin, just reminded me. I think a far better measurement of my like maturation as a man is not how I talk about women, but how I talk about other men. Like I'll be just as willing in public with a man or with a woman or with anybody to be like, my God, that man was beautiful. And I may not have any genuine sexual interest in that man, but I have learned that it is perfectly fine to appreciate, like, did you see the bone structure on that motherfucker? Like, good Lord. And I think that's a far greater indication of my comfort with myself than whether or not I use derogatory language.
Dan, here's a question for you. What is the relationship for you between like love and emotional connection and like sex and like physical gratification? Like, are those the same thing, and has that changed?
I think it has changed. But I think a lot of because I'm not a behavioral psychologist or a doctor of any kind, I can only speak from my own personal experience. And I think my experience with love and romance and sexuality is also an experience of healing. Yeah. And I think that for a lot of my earlier life and in my 20s, there was a pretty sharp divide between genuine love and sexuality and a pretty deep fear of intimacy and being really accepted and being really loved for who I was. For a lot of my early life, early mid 20s, even into my late 20s, this feeling of like, wow, this woman seems to really love me. What's wrong with her?
Oh, God. Yeah.
Yeah.
Colin is pointing.
Yeah.
Oh, dear.
Oh, God. That's so real.
I don't think that's an uncommon feeling for men. I'm also a recovering avoidant, somebody with really strong avoidant tendencies. And that's something I'm continuing to work on. Somebody who is prone to emotional and relational anorexia, meaning it's easy for me to just isolate and separate. So only with like a lot of internal work have the spheres of sexuality and genuine love started to really come together. And I'm ready to I'm open to genuine intimacy. Genuine intimacy being like a physical connection that is also deeply trusting and emotionally vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
For a long time, I think those two paths, nary the way did cross. And now I am at a place in my life where I want those paths to cross. I am like no longer, this is very personal for your podcast, for your podcast audience, but
yeah.
I personally am like no longer in a place in my life where I'm like, I'm not really all that interested in like purely physical hookups. I don't judge those who are looking for that. But for me, I'm like, I'm just at a different place developmentally currently at this point.
That's legit. I mean, I this is one of the things that I found like the most change in as I'm transitioning of, I mean, there's just like all of the chemical stuff that they tell you about. I remember very like from, I think it was high school. It was like hiking club. And they took us all aside, took all the girls aside and said, when you get into the forest, after a couple days, the boys are going to start looking attractive to you. And this is a weird, like, it's not real and you need to stay away from them. But you're going to start having this like survival instinct to get a man near you. And when they get all rugged and stuff, like legitimately, like, be careful about what your hormones are telling you. And I remember being in horrible relationships with very bad men, but being afraid to leave because I'm like, well, if I don't find another guy, how am I ever going to be a wife and have kids? And also just, you know, those chemicals that are released of like having sexual pleasure or physical pleasure tells you that this is a person you need to keep, like just hormonally or whatever. Like this, suddenly you start to trust and be bonded to a person who is objectively terrible and you weren't intending to get into this, and you might end up marrying that person just because of, you know, like it's very weird. And now I'm like, sex and love, very separate, like organs in my body, you know, like this is not the same person, or like this, like it blows my mind how different that feeling is. And I think some of it is that like biological clock that women are like, you know, socialized or physically, you know, you got to get somebody by the time you're 30, and maybe that means locking them down when you're 14. But like, is that something that you have seen, I guess, dating women? Like, do you feel like you're approaching it from a different place?
Oh, well, I think what you've just described about hiking club is what happens at Bible college. Like, I think that's why like 18-year-olds marry 21-year-olds youth pastors. Like there's just this need of like, this one will do. Yeah. And there is this kind of panic.
I think you look so disgusted.
I started marrying their youth pastor, and I had a visceral like, sorry.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to be said for the evolutionary instinct. The evolutionary instinct of like, well, if I'm going to have a child, I need to have a good mate, and that mate has to be somebody who's able to help care for the child. And I mean, again, I'm like only approaching this from like a total armchair position, but I've also heard that like the male drive is a lot more, I just got to like make offspring, get genes out there. Yeah. But I don't know that the love sex piece is inherently evolutionary or scientific.
Yeah.
I can't help but wonder if that is like, I think that's like a personal journey thing.
Yeah.
And I think that what you're describing almost just sounds a little bit like the inverse of my experience, where I think I am like craving what I'm craving because I feel like I've like healed up some stuff. Like that's like a positive feeling. And I'm ready to like accept something that I might not have been able to accept when I was younger. I think that's just a matter of, you know, the personal journey. Yeah. I don't know how to make that more like a broad cultural or,
you know, social. You're not here to fix the world. You're here to share your experience as Travis Kelce.
Yes. We're three masked white people on the internet, so we are allowed to have armchair opinions on literally everything. So
we're gonna fix it.
Yeah, that's our jobs, is to superhero everything. I sort of had as Laser, you'll be shocked by this, I had a fuckboy phase when,
and I love it, and I wish I'd known you. But go on.
Yeah. In like my early mid 20s, and people at home might be asking, but he said he's demisexual. How does that line up?
Mm-hmm.
So as a fuckboy, I was also a side piece a lot.
Oh, wow.
Because self-worth. And I didn't think that I was worth more than being someone's like escape.
Mm-hmm.
And then that quickly ended when I got my first death threat from a jilted spouse. So
first of all, it would be a great movie. Second, I'm glad that you're not in that phase because it sounds like it involved a lot of self-hate, but also
yeah.
If I may be so bold as to ask it is a personal question, but it's also kind of a social question. So I'm curious. Yeah. One, have you ever, I ask because this term has been used with me, and I'm curious if you have heard the term a sports fuck.
Never heard of that in my life.
The way this was used with me, somebody very casually, I was expressing feeling a lack of confidence with women, and they were attempting to pay me a compliment. And they were like, oh, dude, you're like a sports fuck. You're like a big dude that women will just like want to get with because like it's a cool experience.
Sure.
And
like bucket list for that was the term I had used for that before. But
we talked about the fetishization of like both of us, like last episode of like it's like, wow, isn't that wild? They have a strange body, which is
like, well, I've tried that now, and then it's like cool.
Feels good. I would say it feels good and humanizing. Yeah.
Yeah, it does. And I think part of that was also what led to it just not being sometimes it was one night stands or whatever, but sometimes it would be more emotional affair vibes or that kind of thing. And the bar is just so low.
Yeah.
It's so low. Like asking questions, just any questions to a person is like seen as above the bar. Asking like remembering if she has like a dietary preference or restriction. And it was just so like mind boggling when I would have these experiences and people would act like it's going above and beyond, which I guess in a messed up way it is, but it's just So I think for me, that was also a byproduct of not like leaning heavily into the I can't care what anyone thinks of me. Like, because if I care what people think of me, then I'm going to get hurt, and I can't get hurt more than I already am by walking outside the door. So, and facing the world that does not like how I look. And now that I'm doing the therapies, I'm unlearning, I'm feeling the stuff, processing this stuff. And like when I get a crush now or something and I'm like, oh no, I care what this person thinks. Like that to me is more intimate than like any like, but then that sort of chicken and egg wise leads to like me valuing sex with that person more or being more like vulnerable about that. Whereas before, if it was just like a reclamation of my own sexuality / that was like denied to me when I was younger / undervaluing my self-worth simultaneously, that led to the fuckboy phase.
Laser, I will say that I think for a lot of my 20s, I can't be sure what Colin just said that spurred this memory, but something jogged it. I think the way that I used to delineate sex and romance was, for a lot of my early adulthood, I would be far more comfortable having a sexual relationship with somebody that I kind of knew deep down I probably didn't have a future with. And I might not even particularly care about, which I'm not really proud of. I don't really feel good about that.
What if you did? That would be interesting to find out about you. If you felt good about that. I am like right now in my head, the thing that I'm thinking is, the point, of starting a masculinity podcast is to have these conversations. And also I would so curious what like Joe Rogan would think about what we're doing right now. It's just like very much, I don't care.
Okay. Yeah. Just like purely. Yeah.
That it just seems like there is a world where people, the Joe Rogan, Elon Musk, like people having emotional conversations is like, they see it as like castrating yourself and getting rid of what makes you truly masculine, which is just like fighting people and climbing mountains and, impregnating as many women as possible. And I think there is a value to finding a kind of masculinity that embraces in what makes you, but also embraces trying not to hurt people with it. that make sense?
Yeah.
I don't think Joe Rogan would mind this podcast because I am on DMT right now.
Oh, great. What is that? Is that a thing he advertised?
It's the hallucinogenic that he like.
Oh, gotcha. Great. Perfect.
All the time. And I think that like, in addition to that, like that masculine piece, or maybe it's not even masculine. Again, maybe it's just like a piece of me that was unhealed, that like, I don't want to open up sexually with somebody that I might actually care about. There was also this inverse thing where if I did actually care about somebody, I would almost try to withhold the sexuality for as long as I could.
Yeah.
I think out of a fear, and maybe it's an evangelical fear of like, once you break that seal, the magic is gone.
Mm.
And so that's been like a part of the healing journey of like, these two things can coexist. Romance and intimacy, sex, like all of this can coexist versus whatever twisted version I have, but also power to the people who just want to enjoy like sex as sex. I think as long as you're doing it in a safe way that everybody has like signed on to and is into, hell yeah, man. It's America 2024.
Hell yeah, brother.
So this brings us back to the question, which we didn't address fully, but I also think is interesting to talk about. That how do you see the dynamic between masculine and feminine in the culture? Because I think some people would say,
I don't know that I fully understand what it means.
Yeah.
The culture means. But
yes, that's fair.
Yeah.
And this might be an anti-trans like talking point that I just hear a lot of, like, there isn't a difference. Like the real difference between being a man and being a woman is your body, and that you can be a tomboy and still be a woman. You know what I mean? There is an interesting, I think, especially for trans men, we're told that we're not really trans. We're just like traumatized by the patriarchy, or we want to have power, or, you know, we want to have, more control, or it's a trauma response to one thing or another. Where I do, as a person who has lived through this experience, I do think that there is a difference between being a man and being a woman in your head. But also I think, obviously including the non-binary and agender identity in that of like gender is also made up. You know what I mean? Like, I think that is an interesting question that I have to think about of like, do I do things because I'm me? Do I do things because I'm a man? Do I think this way because of this? And how does it matter? You know what I mean? Like, I do think it exists. I think it I don't know. What do you think, Colin?
Yeah, it's a big conversation. I think for me, like, because I keep thinking of the quote that like someone said of like, if a guy does it, then it's something that a guy does. Like as far as like behaviors being inherently masculine, feminine, men, women, etc. And for me, existing as a non-binary person is like more so the social aspect of it. Of I already don't feel at home in existing as a man because I'm not, inherently able to do a lot of the things that people set as the metrics of what makes a guy a guy. And also I never really understood that we have to do these things because of the body that we exist in, which is very neurospicy of me, apparently. And yeah, like the social rules and stuff. So I think as far as the culture goes, I think there's also like a million different cultures. There's like, even in pockets of New York, there's people who will, like communities who will have like in friend groups who will have a completely different view of how they experience being a guy or being a woman or being a non-binary person or being a agender person or like that kind of thing. Like I don't feel the need to do anything with my body as far as like hormonal or surgical as to feel a sense of gender euphoria, because I feel detached from the entire thing as being represented by how my body is. But I also am not going to be like, the way I experience the world is how it actually is. And therefore, if anyone feels sort of attachment to their body as far as how they experience the world, that's wrong, because that would be hypocritical as hell.
Yeah.
And also, again, you're going to edit this out, but I'm not a monolith. So.
Okay. I'll allow that one.
Oh, that one. Yeah.
Dan, yeah.
Yes.
I think I did a great job of not answering the question.
You did a really good job, and I'm really proud of you.
Around it. So thank you.
I'm sort of curious, Dan, but sorry, please give your thought.
No, go ahead. You first.
My question for you, Dan, is how do you know you're a man?
Oh, wow. That's a great question. With the previous question, I was going to just start talking and see if I landed somewhere.
Great.
This is a really good question. How do I know I'm a man? Well, the obvious answer is that for my entire life, people have told me that's what I was, and I never disagreed.
It feels okay.
I never felt any sense that that was incorrect. All of the biological, psychological, and physiological signs that people were said, that's what being a boy, being a teenage boy, and then being a man is. I was like, yeah, that fits. Mm-hmm. Now, at the same time, there is a lot of instances in my life where I have not felt like a particularly masculine man. Mm-hmm. So I may feel like a man, but there's a lot of days I'm like, I'm kind of an effeminate man, or I'm kind of a sensitive man.
Yeah.
Now, I have learned as I've gotten older that those things are not non-masculine.
Right.
Those things do not make me any less of a man. I am sensitive. I am emotional. I do tend to feel my way through the world. I'm not a super hard charging type A. I think it's hilarious when dudes refer to themselves as alphas. Mm-hmm. I think it's so funny. I have
not
never
sigmas. now sigma is the peak.
Yeah. Right. And Colin, you do have sigma energy.
Thanks, Dan. I'm gonna end the call now.
Oh, great! They're
completely different reason. This is the worst insult I've gotten.
I'm sorry. Listen,
and I got followed home like 2 weeks ago. I didn't get followed home. That's a joke. I got followed out of the subway.
So I think there have been many times where I've kind of like questioned, am I man enough? Am I being man enough? I mean, I'm a man, but am I meeting the expectations of what being a man is? Mm-hmm. And I have learned to accept that all of the qualities that I have are a part of my manhood, my masculinity. This is a bit of a diversion, but I also think that all people have femininity and masculinity. Yeah. I think the mistake is in trying to completely ascribe or completely identify with one or the other. Yeah. Just because that's like
it does feel like masculine and feminine is very different than man and woman and person. Yes. Like, yes. Do you think being a man is a big part of your identity, for example?
I don't think for me personally, but it seems to be a big part of my identity to everyone else.
Mm. Yeah. Do you think that has to do with your height?
Maybe. I think I am very, very aware of my being a man because I can't operate in the world without knowing how aware everyone else is of my being a man. But I don't think I like make a lot of decisions based on like, what would a man do? I'm not really doing that a lot. Yeah.
If I can offer final thoughts on that.
Please. Okay, Colin Buckingham, any final thoughts?
Yeah. Well, wow. It's so weird of you to ask out of nowhere. So unprompted. I think geographically and chronologically, what has constituted what like is masc or femme or like what men and women do has changed dramatically when you look at like who's worn makeup, who's worn wigs, who's worn heels, like even as far as like hunter-gatherer roles in society and stuff has been very nuanced. I think that a lot of how we view it in a modern way are these things that were like written by very sexist people and who don't really have like the whole tall, dark, and handsome thing was created by men. And there's like apparently something that was done that apparently men will promote other men who are taller than them to positions higher than they are, or like because of this subconscious thing of like valuing that more than their own self-interest, which is like hilarious that capitalism and individualism gives way to height. To me, I find that deeply funny.
Yeah.
And I think that like there's your point, Dan, about like I exist as a man in part because of how people have viewed me. I think for me, like and this is more in regards to the dwarfism thing rather than gender stuff, but I think for me, I'm in more of a space of like, however you view me, that's on you. Mm. And like, I'm not going to maybe feed into that. I'm not going to, you know, wear a leprechaun suit or whatever and like play into whatever stereotypes or assumptions you've made. But if you are going to assume that I'm like inherently like creepy or weird, I'm not going to, you know, go full goblin mode and start like scuttling around or whatever. But, and I think like Dan, without presuming, there's behaviors that you don't want to do. Like I'm sure you've had things about like imposing to people or appearing threatening to people that you've had to like figure out and navigate your relationship with that. And I think me, to an extent, I'm like, you know, I'm going to exist and do how I feel. And like, if people view that as inherently masculine or view it as inherently like a thing that I should do or are confused by it because of how I look, then that's kind of their thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think the best way I know how to say it is if somebody were to ask me, how do you be a good man? Most of the answers I would give would just be like, how do you be a good person?
Yeah.
It's not like my answers for like how you be a good man is this column and how you be a good woman is this column. I would probably answer the same way just because of that. I'm more interested in being a good soul in the world. Like I want to be a good
go to heaven. Not go to heaven.
Yes, I want to go to heaven. I don't want to go to hell. I'm very afraid. So like I'm interested in like ultimately the humanity of myself and others. And I think how I would answer that question is like, I guess why do I feel like a man? Yeah, I guess because I don't feel like anything else.
Yeah.
Which I think is why I don't really take issue with people saying like, well, it was given to me and I didn't agree.
Yeah.
Like, fair enough.
Yeah.
You know?
You don't know what it's like to not agree with that particular thing. So you assume that other people are telling the truth. Yeah.
So who am I to deny it?
Yeah. I don't know. You're pretty tall. You could tell anybody anything they wanted. According to studies. I am so thankful for both of you. This was a very interesting conversation for me. I feel like I'm growing up every time I talk to just such beautiful, strong, emotional people. So thank you for talking to me.
I'm really proud of you, Laser.
Thank you. Thank you to our listeners. Thank you for people who submitted questions. We have so many good questions and more episodes coming up to talk about them. God bless you. Oh, Dan Prevette, do you want to tell people to follow you on Instagram or anything? Would you like to?
For sure. Yeah, you can find me on Instagram at Dan Prevette, DanPrevette. I'll see you there.
And if you're an evangelical, troll him. He loves it. He loves being insulted by Christians.
Is that my favorite? We'll have a spirited debate in the comments.
Amazing.
I didn't know. I thought spirited was a pun.
Oh, that's good. That's good.
Oh,
wow! You went a whole episode without that many puns.
I went 2 whole episodes.
You got to bring your value here. You got to get that.
I know. Yeah, that's my value as a man, is my puns.
Really leaning into the non-binary this time. Okay.
That's so sick, Kyle.
Yeah. Oh god.